Clara Vance had always believed that libraries were sanctuaries of silence, where dust particles danced in afternoon sunlight and secrets slept peacefully between yellowed pages. At 38, she had spent nearly 15 years as the head librarian of Millbrook's modest public library, and she thought she knew every corner, every creak, every whispered story within its walls. She was wrong. The morning that would change everything began like any other Tuesday in October. Clara arrived at 7:30 a.m., her keys jingling softly as she unlocked the heavy oak doors. The familiar scent of old paper and leather bindings greeted her, along with something else, something that made her pause in the doorway, her hand still on the doorknob. The air felt different today, charged with an energy she couldn't quite identify. She shook her head, dismissing the feeling as pre-coffee anxiety. The library's annual local history week was approaching, and she had mountains of work to complete. The digitization project for the old archives had been consuming her evenings and weekends for months, particularly the collection of maps and documents her grandfather Arthur had bequeathed to the library before his death 5 years ago. Clara still missed him terribly. Arthur Vance had been the town's unofficial historian, a retired geography teacher who spent his golden years collecting what he called the real stories, not the sanitized versions found in official records, but the human tales that gave Millbrook its soul. He had always insisted that their quiet town held more secrets than people realized, a notion Clara had indulged with affectionate skepticism. Every place is layers, Clara Bear, he used to say, his weathered hands tracing invisible patterns in the air. Like an onion, but instead of making you cry, peeling back each layer makes you wonder. She had loved his enthusiasm, even if she never quite shared his conviction that Millbrook harbored any great mysteries. Now, surrounded by boxes of his meticulously organized documents, Clara felt the familiar pang of guilt. She had promised to honor his legacy by properly cataloging everything, but the work felt overwhelming. Maps upon maps, some dating back to the town's founding in 1847, others as recent as the 1990s. Some were official survey documents, others appeared to be Arthur's own hand-drawn interpretations of the town's layout. It was these personal maps that troubled her most. They looked ordinary enough from a distance, but when she examined them closely, she noticed something unsettling. Faint markings. Symbols that seemed to shift and shimmer when she wasn't looking directly at them. Tiny notations in her grandfather's careful handwriting, so small they were nearly invisible to the naked eye. She had mentioned these peculiarities to Mr. Abernathy, her grandfather's oldest friend and the town's retired postmaster. His reaction had been odd. His eyes had lit up with an intensity that made her uncomfortable, and he had mumbled something about Arthur's true legacy and the town's real blueprint. When she pressed him for clarification, he had simply smiled and patted her shoulder, saying, "All in good time, dear. All in good time." The State Historical Society had also expressed interest in acquiring some of the library's older documents for a major exhibition, which should have been exciting. Instead, Clara found herself strangely protective of her grandfather's work, particularly the maps with their mysterious annotations. She had been delaying their visit, telling herself she needed more time to properly catalog everything first. The scanner chose that moment to emit its familiar electronic whine, jolting Clara from her memories. She had been trying to digitize her grandfather's maps for weeks, but the antique device seemed to have developed a personal vendetta against the documents. Every time she attempted to scan one of Arthur's hand-drawn maps, the machine would malfunction, producing distorted images or shutting down entirely. "Come on," she muttered, adjusting the map's position for the third time. "Just this once, work with me." The scanner hummed to life, its light bar traveling slowly across the paper. Clara held her breath, but halfway through the scan, the machine emitted a sharp beep and went silent. The display screen flickered and died. "Perfect," she sighed, unplugging the device and plugging it back in. As she waited for it to restart, she found herself studying the map more closely. This one depicted the town center, with careful attention to the old courthouse, the park, and the network of streets that had barely changed since her childhood. But there, in the margin, she could see them again, those mysterious symbols. One looked like a compass rose, but with too many points. Another resembled a tree, but with roots that seemed to extend far beyond what should be possible. And there, near the library's location, a symbol that made her heart skip a beat. It looked almost like a key, but with an intricate pattern that seemed to pulse with its own internal light. Clara blinked hard, convinced her eyes were playing tricks on her. When she looked again, the symbol appeared perfectly ordinary, just ink on paper, faded with age. But the feeling lingered, a sensation like static electricity running along her skin. The library's front door chimed, and Clara quickly set the map aside as Mrs. Henderson, one of her regular patrons, entered with her usual Tuesday morning smile. "Good morning, Clara. You're looking a bit pale, dear. Are you feeling all right?" "Just tired," Clara replied, forcing a smile. "The local History Week preparations are keeping me busy." Mrs. Henderson's expression grew thoughtful. "Oh, yes. I remember how excited your grandfather used to get about these events. He always said there was so much more to discover about our little town than most people realized." She paused, studying Clara's face. "You know, he used to come in here during the last months of his life, working on something he called his final project. Never would tell anyone what it was, but he seemed so hopeful about it." There it was again, that same mysterious tone everyone seemed to adopt when discussing her grandfather's work. Clara felt a flicker of irritation. "I'm sure he just meant that every place has interesting stories if you know where to look." "Perhaps," Mrs. Henderson said, but her knowing smile suggested she thought otherwise. "Though, I do hope you'll give his maps the attention they deserve." Arthur was quite thorough in his research. He spent years walking every street, talking to every family. Some people thought he was just being sociable, but I think he was looking for something specific. After Mrs. Henderson left, Clara found herself drawn back to the troublesome maps. She retrieved an old magnifying glass from her desk drawer, a heavy, brass-framed antique that had belonged to her grandfather. The handle was worn smooth from years of use, and engraved along its edge were tiny symbols that she had always assumed were purely decorative. As she adjusted the focus, positioning the glass over one of the mysterious symbols, something extraordinary happened. The symbol began to glow. Not brightly, and not in any way that would be visible without the magnifying glass, but there was definitely a soft, golden luminescence emanating from the ink. Clara's hands trembled as she moved the glass to another symbol, then another. Each one responded the same way, as if the magnifying glass were somehow activating a hidden property in the ink. Her heart pounding, Clara reached for the brass bookmark that had been her grandfather's favorite, an ornate piece with intricate engravings that she had always assumed were purely decorative. As she used it to hold down the map while examining the symbols, something clicked. Literally. The bookmark's engravings aligned perfectly with one of the symbols on the map, and Clara heard a soft mechanical sound, like a tiny lock opening. The symbol's glow intensified, and suddenly, a thin golden line began to trace itself across the paper, connecting to other symbols in a complex network that sprawled across the entire map. Clara jerked backward, knocking over her coffee mug and sending papers scattering across the floor. The golden lines faded immediately, leaving the map looking perfectly ordinary once again. She sat there, breathing hard, wondering if she was losing her mind. The rest of the day passed in a haze of distraction. Clara found herself making errors in simple tasks, misfiling returned books, giving patrons incorrect information, nearly locking herself out of the building during her lunch break. Every time someone spoke to her, she felt like she was hearing them from underwater. Young Tommy Morrison, a regular after-school visitor, noticed her distraction immediately. "Miss Vance, you seem really nervous today. Are you okay?" "Just busy preparing for next week's event," Clara managed, though her hands were shaking as she checked out a stack of adventure novels. Tommy tilted his head, studying her with the unnerving perceptiveness of a 12-year-old. "My mom says your grandfather was working on something really important before he died. Something about the town's history. She says some people think he found something that could change everything." Clara's blood ran cold. "What do you mean, change everything?" "I don't know," Tommy shrugged. Mom gets weird when I ask about it. But she says your grandfather was asking lots of questions about old families, about who lived where and when. Like he was trying to solve a puzzle. After Tommy left, Clara felt the weight of the afternoon pressing down on her. She kept glancing at the box of maps, half expecting them to start glowing on their own. The rational part of her mind insisted that she had imagined everything, that stress and sleeplessness had made her hallucinate. But the other part, the part that had inherited her grandfather's curiosity, whispered that something profound was waiting to be discovered. When closing time arrived, Clara was almost relieved to lock the doors and head home to her small apartment above the town's bakery. But the smell of fresh bread and the familiar comfort of her living room did nothing to calm her racing thoughts. She found herself pacing, unable to focus on her usual evening routine of tea and reading. Sleep wouldn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw those golden lines, tracing patterns that seemed somehow familiar, like a half-remembered dream. The symbols seemed to pulse behind her eyelids, calling to her with an urgency she couldn't ignore. At 2 a.m., she gave up and dressed quickly. At 3 a.m., she was letting herself back into the library through the rear entrance, her hands trembling as she turned the key. The building felt different in the darkness, more alive, somehow. Shadows seemed to shift and whisper as Clara made her way to her desk, guided only by the dim glow of the emergency exit signs. She turned on her small reading lamp, the circle of warm light creating an island of safety in the vast darkness. The box of maps sat exactly where she had left it, but now it seemed to hum with potential energy. Clara retrieved the brass magnifying glass and the ornate bookmark, setting them carefully on her desk. This time, she was ready for the glow. She moved systematically from symbol to symbol, using the bookmark to unlock each one, watching as the golden network grew more complex and beautiful. The lines weren't random. They formed a pattern, a map within a map that seemed to reveal connections between locations throughout the town. As she worked, Clara began to notice something else. Some of the symbols weren't just glowing. They were moving. Tiny figures appeared within the golden lines, like living illustrations walking along the paths her grandfather had drawn. She saw what looked like children playing in the park, elderly couples sitting on benches, neighbors helping each other with groceries. The entire map was alive with these miniature scenes of community life. But it was the symbol near the library that held her attention longest. The key-shaped marking had transformed into something that looked almost like a doorway, and through it, Clara could see what appeared to be a staircase, leading down into darkness. The image was so vivid that she reached out to touch it, her finger passing through empty air above the paper. She was so absorbed in studying the moving symbols that she nearly missed the soft sound from the library's back room, a gentle thud, like something heavy settling onto the floor. Clara froze, her hand still holding the magnifying glass over the map. The sound came again, followed by what sounded like something rolling across the wooden floor. The golden lines on the map pulsed brighter, as if responding to the sounds. Clara looked up from the map, suddenly aware that she wasn't alone in the building. But that was impossible. She had locked the doors herself, and the security system would have triggered if anyone had entered through the front. "Hello," she called softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is someone there?" Silence. Then, from the back room, came a sound that made her blood freeze, a soft melody, like a music box playing a lullaby. It was a tune she recognized, one her grandfather used to hum while working on his maps. Clara set down the magnifying glass and stood slowly, her legs unsteady. The back room was used for storage, filled with donations that hadn't been sorted, old furniture waiting for repair, and boxes of books that might never see the light of day. She rarely went back there, especially not at night. But something was calling to her now, a pull she couldn't resist. The melody grew stronger as she approached, and with it came the faint scent of her grandfather's cologne, Old Spice and pipe tobacco, a combination that transported her instantly to childhood afternoons spent in a study. She grabbed a flashlight from her desk drawer and made her way toward the back room, her footsteps echoing in the empty library. The door was slightly ajar, though she was certain she had closed it earlier. Through the gap, she could see a soft, pulsing light, like candlelight flickering in a gentle breeze. The flashlight beam revealed the usual clutter, but something was different. In the center of the room, a large, ornate globe that had been sitting on a high shelf for as long as Clara could remember was now on the floor. It appeared to be undamaged, resting upright as if it had been carefully placed there rather than fallen. But the globe was no longer the dusty antique she remembered. It was glowing from within, its surface covered in the same mysterious symbols she had been studying on the maps. The continents seemed to shift and breathe, and the oceans appeared to be actually moving, tiny waves lapping against miniature shores. Clara approached cautiously, kneeling beside the globe. It was beautiful, a work of art more than a practical reference tool. The continents were rendered in exquisite detail, with tiny cities marked in gold leaf and ocean currents traced in silver. But as she examined it more closely, she noticed something that made her breath catch. There, at the base of the globe, was a small keyhole. Not a modern lock, but something older, more ornate. The brass surrounding it was decorated with the same symbols she had been studying on her grandfather's maps. And etched around the keyhole in her grandfather's familiar handwriting were the words, "For Clara, when you're ready to see." Her hands shaking, Clara reached into her pocket and pulled out the brass bookmark. She had carried it with her ever since the morning's strange discoveries, and now, looking at it in the flashlight's beam, she realized it wasn't just a bookmark. The ornate engravings along its length matched the symbols around the keyhole perfectly. It was a key. The bookmark fit perfectly into the globe's keyhole. As Clara turned it, she heard a series of soft clicks and whirs, like the sound of an intricate clockwork mechanism coming to life. The globe began to glow brighter, and with a soft hiss, it opened along a seam she hadn't noticed before. Inside was not the hollow space she had expected, but something far more extraordinary. The globe contained a perfect miniature replica of Millbrook, complete down to the smallest detail. Every building, every street, every tree was represented in exquisite craftsmanship. But this wasn't a static model, it was alive. Tiny lights flickered in the windows of the miniature buildings. The small trees swayed in an unfelt breeze. Miniature people walked the streets, their movements so lifelike that Clara could almost hear their conversations. And there, in the center of the model, was a tiny library, its windows glowing warmly in the darkness. As Clara watched in amazement, a small projector hidden within the globe's base activated, casting a holographic image onto the wall behind her. The image showed the town from above, but not as she had ever seen it. Golden lines of light connected every building, every street corner, every park bench. The entire town was revealed as a vast network of connections, a living web of relationships and shared experiences. The holographic display zoomed in on various locations throughout Millbrook, showing scenes that made Clara's heart swell. She saw the grocery store owner quietly paying for an elderly customer's groceries. High school students helping a neighbor repair his fence. The librarian, herself, staying late to help a struggling reader. Countless small acts of kindness and connection that formed the invisible threads binding the community together. And then her grandfather's voice filled the room. "My dearest Clara." The recording began, and Clara felt tears spring to her eyes. "If you're hearing this, then you've found your way to the heart of my greatest discovery. What you're seeing isn't just a map of our town, it's a map of its soul." The holographic display shifted, showing Arthur himself, standing in the same back room where Clara now knelt. He looked younger than she remembered, his eyes bright with excitement and purpose. "I spent 40 years mapping these connections," Arthur's voice continued. "Not the official ones you'll find in city records, but the real ones, the ones that make a place more than just buildings and streets. Every symbol on those maps represents a point of light in our town's true history. Every line connects hearts, not just locations." The display showed Arthur walking through the town with his notebook, stopping to talk with neighbors, recording not just what they said, but how they connected with others. Clara saw him documenting the way Mrs. Patterson always left extra vegetables from her garden on the library steps for anyone who needed them. She saw him mapping the informal network of childcare that allowed single parents to work. She watched him trace the connections between the elderly residents who checked on each other daily, creating a safety net that existed nowhere in official records. But this isn't just about documenting what exists, Arthur's voice said, and the hologram showed him working late into the night, adding new symbols to his maps. It's about understanding how communities truly function, how kindness creates its own geography. Every act of compassion changes the map, creates new connections, strengthens the whole. Clara sank to her knees, overwhelmed by the beauty and complexity of what her grandfather had created. The town she thought she knew was revealed as something far more magical, a place where every person's story was connected to every other person's story, where kindness rippled outward in endless, invisible circles. But maps are only useful if they inspire journeys, Arthur's voice said, and the hologram shifted to show Clara herself, standing in the library, surrounded by the glowing network of connections. Your journey, Clara Bear, is just beginning. The town doesn't need another keeper of old secrets. It needs someone who can help others discover the secrets they're creating every day. The recording showed more scenes, possibilities rather than memories. Clara saw herself leading groups of children on kindness walks, helping them identify the connections in their own neighborhood. She watched herself working with teenagers to create a living history project, documenting the ongoing stories of their community. She saw the library transformed into a hub of connection, where people came not just to find information but to share their own stories and discover their place in the larger tapestry of community life. The maps will show you where to begin, Arthur's voice said, and the hologram zoomed in on specific locations throughout the town. But you'll write the rest of the story. You'll help others see that they're not isolated individuals, but part of something beautiful and interconnected. You'll show them that every small act of kindness matters, every moment of connection counts. The recording ended, leaving Clara alone with the glowing model and the weight of her grandfather's trust. She understood now why everyone had been so mysterious about Arthur's work. This wasn't just a collection of maps and documents. It was a love letter to the community, a testament to the power of human connection, a guide for creating the kind of world where everyone belonged. As she sat there, surrounded by the soft glow of the miniature town, Clara felt something shift inside her. The quiet librarian who had always felt like a spectator in her own life was gone, replaced by someone who could see the extraordinary in the ordinary, who understood that every story mattered, every connection was sacred. She spent the rest of the night exploring the model, discovering details she had never noticed in the real town. The miniature library had tiny books on its shelves, each one no bigger than a grain of rice, but perfectly formed. The park had benches where miniature figures sat reading, talking, feeding pigeons. The main street bustled with activity as the tiny townspeople went about their daily lives, creating connections and strengthening bonds with every interaction. Dawn was breaking when Clara finally returned to her apartment, but she felt more energized than she had in years. She had plans to make, programs to design, a community to serve in ways she had never imagined possible. The next morning, Clara arrived at the library with a new sense of purpose. She spent the day rearranging the local History Week display, creating space for her grandfather's incredible discovery. But she didn't simply put the maps and globe on display, she turned them into an interactive experience. She created a system where visitors could use the brass magnifying glass to reveal the hidden symbols on the maps, and she set up the globe so that people could activate the holographic display themselves. But most importantly, she created a new section of the exhibit titled The Living Map, where community members could add their own stories of connection and kindness. She also began reaching out to various community groups, explaining her vision for new programs that would help people see and celebrate the connections that bound them together. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Teachers wanted to bring their classes to learn about community mapping. The senior center asked her to lead workshops on sharing stories. The youth group requested training on how to document acts of kindness in their own neighborhoods. When Mr. Abernathy arrived for the opening of Local History Week, he found Clara standing beside the display, her face radiant with joy and purpose. "You found it," he said simply, his eyes twinkling with unshed tears. "He knew I would," Clara replied. "He always believed I was braver than I thought I was." Mr. Abernathy nodded, then pulled out a small, worn notebook. "He asked me to give you this when you were ready. It's his field notes, observations about the town's connections that he made over the years. He thought you might want to continue the work." Clara accepted the notebook with trembling hands. As she opened it, she saw pages and pages of her grandfather's careful handwriting, documenting acts of kindness, moments of connection, and the ever-growing network of relationships that made Millbrook more than just a place on a map. "There's something else," Mr. Abernathy said quietly. "Arthur wasn't the only one working on this project. There are others, people in towns across the country, who are mapping their own communities' connections. He was part of a network, and now you are too." The opening day of Local History Week was unlike any the library had ever hosted. Word of Arthur's discovery spread quickly through the town, and people came not just to look at old artifacts, but to participate in something living and immediate. Children used the magnifying glass to reveal the secret symbols, gasping with delight as the golden lines appeared. Adults found themselves sharing stories they had never told, adding their own threads to the tapestry of community connection. Clara watched it all with a sense of profound fulfillment. The quiet library had become a hub of activity, but more than that, it had become a place where people could see themselves as part of something larger, something beautiful and meaningful. As the days passed, Clara's new programs began to take shape. She organized kindness scavenger hunts, where participants searched for acts of compassion happening around them. She created connection walks, guided tours that helped people see familiar places with new eyes. She established a living history project where community members could document and share their own stories of connection and belonging. The library became more than a repository of the past. It became a celebration of the present, a place where the ongoing story of Millbrook could be written, shared, and treasured. And Clara, once a quiet keeper of books, had become a guardian of living stories, a navigator of the invisible maps that connected every heart to every other heart. The transformation was complete, but the adventure was just beginning.